Do you get told to write for your reader, but don't really know what that means? Have you given a presentation that you felt covered all the details, but didn't seem to interest the audience? Hey, co authors. Today I get a chance to talk with Stanford Professor Jack Baker on his new book, Communication by Design An Engineer's Guide to Sharing Your Research. Whether you're in engineering, STEM, or the humanities, his book is chock full of great ideas for making sure your research has the greatest impact on the most people. So let's dive in. Hey, co authors. I'm excited today because I get to interview Jack Baker, who is a professor at Stanford University. He is the William Alden Campbell and Martha Campbell Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Stanford. He's also the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. He was a visiting researcher at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and he has numerous university, national, and international awards, over 400 publications, has been cited over 31,000 times, and his most cited piece, in case you're interested in it, is The Efficient Analytical Fragility Function Fitting Using Dynamic Structural Analysis. It's been cited over 2,000 times. I'm excited today because he has recently written a book on sharing your research. It's an amazing text. It's coming out. He gave me an advanced copy. I got a chance to read it. It's called Communication by Design, An Engineer's Guide to Sharing Your Research. So I got the chance to interview him today and talk to him a little bit about the stuff that he's doing in his book. And I know that he has some really good tips for aspiring, new, and even seasoned researchers. So, Jack, very nice to meet you. Good to see you, man. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. So just to start off a little bit, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are the things that you're interested in, the stuff that you're doing right now? What is it that's motivating you to keep writing?
Sure. So my training is as a civil engineer, and I work on problems related to assessing the impacts of natural disasters to the built environment. So how do earthquakes and storms and fires damage buildings, damage infrastructure? What does that do to communities, and what does the recovery process look like? So my primary day job is really doing research about those topics, but a real passion of mine and something that I think has been integral to my success as a scholar has been around communication. So I really think a lot about these technical concepts that can be quite detailed. How do we communicate those more broadly? How do we make sure that our audience, both myself, my advisees, and my broader scholarly community, how do we make sure those ideas connect and actually have some impact in the world? And so it's a bit of a passion project, but I've really tried to dig a little bit into the communication side of things as a complement to my engineering work.
I love that. I mean, obviously, you're talking to a guy, my comm studies is my background. So getting to hear that other people are interested in those types of concepts, those ideas, and are really kind of focused on them is always exciting for me. What are some things that you think really motivates this connection between communication and the public that you hope your advisees are served?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is something I'm interested to tease out with you a little bit, is how does my perspective as an engineer align with your perspective as a communication scholar? Where might we differ a little bit and disagree on some things? One concept that resonated with me as I was digging into this project and as I thought about my kind of failures as a communicator over the years is that in engineering, we use this design process quite often where we don't just dig in and start creating things, but we take a few moments and we first try to empathize of like, what is really the problem here? Who are we trying to serve? What are the people we're trying to work with? What do they need? Then spend some time defining like, what is really the possible solution? What is the path forward? Brainstorm a bit so we don't just jump straight to our final solution. We take some time kind of thinking through ideas about what might be possible solutions, kind of keep an open mind. Don't just edit right offhand. Maybe something outside of the box will be a great opportunity. Then we prototype, make a quick, easy demonstration of a possible solution, and then we test it and refine it. We get it out in front of people, get some feedback, and then we polish things up once we understand kind of how our prototype's working. And so we use that process to design buildings, to design cars, to design electrical circuits. And I think it really works well for communication as well. And so that was that idea that really resonated for me.
Yeah, and for those of you who are interested, the process that Jack just explained there, empathize, define, brainstorm, prototype, test, and refine, that is one of the central features of his book. And one of the things that I think makes it really strong is it's a heuristic device that he carries through all the chapters. And I think it really helps the reader of that book and an aspiring researcher really think to themselves, both how am I planning the research that I want to conduct, and then also how am I taking that research and then communicating that effectively to different types of audiences. So I really liked that you introduced that and that you kept returning to that heuristic device throughout the book. I thought it was a very cool one.
Great. I'm glad it resonated for you. It's kind of a natural way of thinking in engineering, but I do think it's really broadly relevant for communicators in all types of fields.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was a little bit worried whenever you sent me the book because I was like, oh man, this is going to be a whole bunch of math and engineering and just a whole bunch of graphs and stuff that's just going to make me go, oh, I don't know what's going on here. But I mean, obviously you're speaking to your field. There is that stuff in there, but I think a lot of the stuff that's in the book is very broadly applicable. Like you said, I think, even in my own field, it never ceases to amaze me whenever I go to a conference and someone just like sits behind a table and reads their paper to the audience. And you're just like, oh my gosh, like if anyone should not be doing this, it's our discipline.
Yeah.
And yet sometimes academics, man, we just kind of get in our own heads.
Absolutely. And I think I for sure, I've done that myself, right? I've gotten up and, either from insecurity or from not thinking about what the audience needed, got a little too in the weeds or got a little too fixated on trying to cover everything I've ever studied rather than have a message. And I think that's where this empathize framing, the first step of the whole process, really comes into play. You're not speaking to yourself. You're not speaking to people who have as much expertise in your particular problem as you do. And if you can step back and really think about like, what's the person that you're looking at? What do they need? What are they going to be excited by? What don't they know that maybe you have to kind of give them some context about? That starting from that can really help mitigate this impulse that we all have to kind of get in the weeds and maybe miss out on that opportunity to connect with our audience in a way that a little bit of empathy can really help with.
Yeah. I just took little snippets out of each chapter. And I thought that, on that note, one of the things that you say in chapter 1 is being thorough isn't the same as being effective. Your audience needs to understand why your work matters, not see every detail. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's especially whenever I'm encountering PhD students or early career faculty, I think are particularly guilty of this. They go to a conference, they feel a little bit insecure about themselves. Maybe it's their first time presenting. And so they think that the most important thing for them to do is to get every detail right. So they just sit there and they read their paper or they read off their PowerPoints or whatever it might be. But that really is not the best place for them to start. So talk a little bit about what are some good takeaways that you would think, or some advice that you would give to someone who's at that stage, giving a presentation to early career faculty, doing their first research project. What are some things that you would tell them?
Yes, I think that this tendency to kind of get in the weeds or to get kind of sidetracked with details, and again, I've done this myself many times as I was trying to learn about communication. The biggest way we can navigate that is, once we get past the empathize and kind of thinking about that audience and what we need, is really spend some time on define this second stage that we've talked about briefly, and really trying to think about like, what is the big idea that you're trying to get across? What is the message that if, the audience walked out of your presentation or if they finished reading your paper, like what's the one thing you would want them to take away? And spend some time thinking about that. It's not always obvious what that would be. The goal is not, I want to describe everything I've ever done in my whole research career. That's a natural instinct, but it's not a good idea in this communication format. When I was writing the book, I was digging into research from education and communication. And one study that I really liked was by Professor Cindy Atman. She's an engineering education professor. And she was looking at this design process. And she gave young students and then some experienced engineers the same design problem. And then she observed how the teams spent their time. And the experts really spent a lot more time on this define stage than the novices did. So the novices just jumped in and started, making things and started working. And again, that's a natural instinct. The experts really paused for a moment and they said, what's our goal here really? What are we trying to achieve? And so when you notice that the experts are doing that, that's an interesting signal that that's maybe a good practice for all of us to try to do. And if we spend some time defining really what our goal is, we can then use that as the lens to consider all of our material that we're wanting to communicate. And one strategy I like to work with my students on is to kind of look through a presentation and look at each piece of content and say, how is this serving that main message? Is this idea that I'm communicating, does it feed into my big story? Or am I just putting it there because it's kind of interesting? And we sometimes talk about interesting but irrelevant content. Like, this is great, it's really cool, but it doesn't belong here because it's not relevant to my main message. So if you can kind of think about that big idea of the main message and then use that as a screen to say, is everything I'm talking about really building towards that? Or have I added in these digressions that are going to confuse my audience or muddle and obscure my main message? That's a great lens to try to help get that clarity of story.
Yeah. And I think that, a lot of times people think, okay, yeah, I have this singular thing that I want to get across. But in order for them to really truly appreciate the genius of my contribution, I need to go and tell all of these other details, all of this backstory, all of this other stuff in order for them to know what my contribution is and how great it is. So what are some ways that you help folks parse out what is actually absolutely necessary for them to get that contribution from your scholarship or from your presentation rather than it being something that's extraneous?
Yeah, that's a hard task. And I think it's
Yeah.
something, there's no 30-second fix to it. I think it really comes from kind of experience and trial and error. One thing, to jump to another step in the process, this test and refine step, I think a great way to work this one is to practice giving a presentation or share a paper draft with a colleague and say, hey, a question that I really like when I'm doing this testing is to say, hey, if I had to cut 20% of this, like what would I cut? Right? Because if you just ask somebody, how does this look? You might get a polite, oh, looks great. You're doing great. But if you say like, what would I have to cut if I had to cut 20%? And you kind of force them to cut something, and they'll say, you know what, like this couple minutes in the middle, you kind of got off track. I didn't really understand how that related to your conclusions. Or, hey, you've got, 3 extra figures in your paper that I just don't understand what they're doing here. They seem a little bit out of place. And you kind of give people permission to identify those things for you. And they may or may not be right? You still need to scrutinize their feedback and decide if you agree, but it's a great way to collect some data and to get some, external validation of like, are you on track? Or did you maybe get a little overzealous about some piece of your work that you're excited about, but just doesn't quite fit in this presentation or this paper?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And especially the idea of putting yourself in a place to where you know that someone's going to give you feedback that's going to be about cutting, right? So that way you don't give a 8-10 minute presentation and then someone says, well, you could cut out a minute or two there. And then you're like, oh, well, how could you do that? This is my darling speech. Like you're from the very beginning, you're expecting them to kind of give you that kind of feedback. And so I think that's a really good mind frame to go into. I think that's really good advice. So I was really interested in this idea of communication capital that you talk about in chapter 2. So this idea that the types of presentations that you give or the writing that you do, that's not just a technical practice of effectiveness, but also it's about building a sort of career trajectory that accumulates over time and really kind of helps establish you as a certain type of scholar. So tell us a little bit about that. Like what made you think that was a strong concept to kind of work through your book with?
Sure, yeah. And here I should give credit to Cal Newport. He's a computer science professor and the best-selling author. So he wrote a book where he coined this term career capital. And I think it applies broadly of once you build rare and valuable skills, it really unlocks opportunities. It gives you the opportunity to choose your own path and to, advance in your career. And I think the concept applies to communication specifically. I think I found this in my career that, my engineering work has been successful, but my efforts to really communicate it broadly and communicate it effectively has really amplified the opportunities that I've been able to have professionally. And I think about my own experience, even, back to my early student days. I would go to a conference and I would look through the program and try to find presentations on topics that I was interested in. But I would also look for presentations by specific people. And I would know, oh, this speaker, I saw that great talk last year. I want to go see them again. And I almost don't even care what they're talking about just because I trust that they're going to use my time wisely and I'm going to leave with some sort of interesting insight. Or I have my Google Scholar alerts set for colleagues that are, working on topics that are of interest to me. So I get my email notifications when new publications come out from them. And I'm putting those alerts on for the people who really write effectively and whose past papers I've really gotten a lot out of. Sometimes it's because the topic is great and the insight is great. Sometimes it's just because it was such a joy to read the paper and I learned a lot. And so I'd really think about that when I'm trying to position my own work to say, if I invest in this communication, if I invest in giving a great talk, I invest in writing a really good paper, there's a benefit for that particular communication effort, but there's also this reputational benefit that if I do a good job this time, it's going to unlock future opportunities, right? I might get invited to go give a keynote presentation from somebody that was in the room, or I might get invited to collaborate on some project by somebody that was inspired by my paper. I wanted to set the stakes for the reader to say, this is more than just doing service to your research. It's really about building your career, creating the opportunities that you want, and that investment in communication is incredibly valuable regardless of your field. It's really an important part of scholarship broadly.
Yeah, and as I was reading that, I was thinking about all of the times that, again, I read other people's work or I go to a conference and I listen to a presentation and I think to myself, man, that was really interesting, but my God, was it a slog to read? Or my God, was that a snooze fest of a presentation? And it really does do a disservice to the intellectual labor that someone has done there whenever they aren't crafting it in a way that really helps it sing. And I know that for a lot of the listeners who might be PhD students, you're reading a whole bunch of stuff assigned to you by your professors. One thing that you should be mindful of as you're reading that stuff, not just for the content, but also to Jack's point, the tone, the writing style, the way that they're presenting their work. And much like you would start practicing a musical instrument by playing other people's pieces, right? You're going to look at that reading and think to yourself, how can I present my research in a similar way, and start to practice that stuff until you develop your own style. And then you become that effective writer.
Yeah, it's such a funny thing that, we go to these conferences and you see these kind of repeated, very dry presentations with a lot of technical detail or kind of unnecessarily complex language that could have been said in a much clearer way. And as you watch it, I find myself, I pay a lot of attention to that just by my nature. Hopefully the audience does the same thing and you think, oh, that could have been so much more compelling. But then we turn around and we have the instinct to do the same thing. I think we learn by watching that. And if academics are doing this as a convention, you kind of feel like, well, maybe I need to do this too. But there are these examples around of the really compelling talk, the person who just made it crystal clear and really focused on their key message and gave you really compelling evidence of why that message is supported. And so the more you can watch those and say, hey, that's an option too. What did they do specifically that I could copy? That's ultimately kind of where my initial thinking came from that turned into this book, is just watching people that were successful and watching the strategies that they utilize.
Yeah. Another thing that I really liked was in chapter 3, you said most writing problems can be resolved by stepping back and re-examining your purpose, your audience, and your voice. When your writing feels wrong and you can't identify why, the issue usually isn't word choice. It's that you've lost sight of one of these 3 anchors. And oh my gosh, right? Like that is such great advice, because I think that so many times whenever, especially again, early writers start their writing, what's motivating them is their own curiosity. It's their own passion for the project or the idea or whatever it is. And we oftentimes don't even think about, someone might actually read this, right? It's instead of, oh, I'm really interested in learning about this thing and like learning through the process of writing. But, writing with an audience in mind, writing with those 3 things in mind, I think it changes the way that you approach the whole project. So what might be some times whenever that's happened to you, or that you've worked with a doctoral student or some other student that you've kind of seen that really help them change the way that they approach writing?
Sure. Yeah. So I think here a common situation that I see arise for myself or with advisees writing is I'll just use myself. I'll start writing and I've got a few pages down. I'm feeling good that there's a bunch of words on the page. And then as I try to edit it, I'm just like kind of struggling to get things organized or struggling to decide how much context to provide for a particular idea. And on one hand, you could say, okay, this is like an editing problem. I just need to kind of move some sentences around and things. And unfortunately, sometimes the problem goes deeper. And the problem is I don't really know what I'm trying to say. Right? I'm just writing down, I'm describing all the work I did, but I don't really know what my message is. I don't really know what my point is. And that's sometimes where writing block comes from. It's hard to even get started because you don't know what you're trying to say. And sometimes it's where editing breaks down. It's like, this is kind of a mess because I haven't really decided what the message is. And no amount of grammar fixes is really going to make a message pop out of that. And so sometimes you just got to put it down, maybe put it down for a couple of days and just step away and say, what's the goal here? Like, what's the message? And if you can get some clarity on that, oftentimes that's like a North Star that can then guide the editing work or can guide the decisions about what background literature review is needed or what amount of detail is needed here, because you kind of know where the finish line is and you know where you're aiming for, and that can trickle back down to your small decisions. Sometimes that's a little painful because identifying your message is hard. That's hard work. But once you realize it, at least it gives you a path forward through that process.
Yeah. I find that for me, whenever I'm having a hard time trying to figure out where my writing is going, what I'll do is I'll write like first draft sort of section as just try to get it out on the page. And then I'll leave it alone for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, before I come back to it, reread what I've written. And that kind of gives me the sense of, okay, yeah, that makes sense and I can work off that. Or, oh my God, what did I write? And then I just have to scrap it and redo it again. But I find that if I try to push too hard, like I don't really know what I'm saying, I work on it day 1. I don't really know what I'm saying at day 2, day 3. By day 4 or 5, I just have a conglomeration of like disconnected ideas. But now I've got so much invested in it, so much sunk cost fallacy that I really don't want to do heavy revision work to it, instead of just doing a little bit and then coming back to it after a couple of weeks. Do you have some tricks that can help folks?
Yeah, that's great. And that's a nice modest counterpoint to, I think, the way I'd frame this. Why don't we tease this out a little bit? I think I was something that might help the audience is to think about, these different purposes of writing. So
Mm.
when I was kind of describing this kind of getting stuck in the editing process, I was thinking about kind of heading towards a final document and you're trying to clean it up, but
Yeah.
it's just not coming together. I think you nicely showed this counterpoint of this writing as kind of a form of brainstorming and prototyping of like, let me get some words down on the page just to organize my thinking, because our mental thinking about these problems oftentimes is quite disorganized and incomplete, but we can convince ourselves we got a story there. When the words get down on paper, then you see, it's not, I don't quite have it here. Like I've got some
Yep.
gaps in my thinking, or maybe I've got some pieces here that are getting a little bit off topic. That's great. I think that's a super helpful part of the communication process. And in these 5-step process we've talked about earlier, that kind of falls in this brainstorming prototyping. If you come into that writing with the understanding that this is not going to turn into my final product and my final product might look nothing at all like this, it's really can be kind of liberating to just say, let's just dump some stuff down on the page and see what it looks like. Maybe none of it stays in the end. Maybe there's some chunks that are really cool, but some big chunks that need to get cut out. That can be quite freeing, but we shouldn't view that as these words I'm putting down here, 80% of them are going to be in my final draft or my final document. That really kind of constrains you, and it can kind of lock you up in your thinking, because you're then worried about, you're editing at the same time that you're creating, and decoupling those two things can really be productive. So this brainstorming stage there, maybe it's not so critical that your message be finalized, but when you get to the stage of kind of polishing things up or organizing, you really need to define that message and figure out what your point is, so that can be that North Star to help you decide what needs to go and what needs to stay and what needs to be cleaned up and emphasized and what needs to be maybe de-emphasized or cut.
Yeah. And I like that you keep using the term the North Star.
Yeah.
Because there's only one, right? I think that like for a lot of folks, whenever they're going through their doctoral programs, you have your 2, 3, 4 classes that you're taking. Maybe you have projects for all of those, right? And so you're trying to complete multiple projects at once. And it's really kind of hard then to kind of get your mind in each one of those things. And I think one of the biggest transitions for me from being a doctoral student to being a professor was, now I have the opportunity to just do one project at a time. What's my North Star for this project? Because I don't want to deviate from that. I don't want to go get messed up with something else. Instead, what's this one thing? And I think that for early career writers, I would encourage you. I know that everyone's like, oh, you got to have your pipeline, 3 things that you're working on all the time. Yes, but no, right? Like you really should be trying to take things one thing at a time, because that helps you, I think, lock in a little bit better than trying to have too many irons in the fire.
Yeah, that's nice. I think another transition, speaking of this kind of graduate student to more senior scholar transition, early days, there's a tendency when you get the opportunity to speak in front of an audience, there's a tendency to say, I'm going to tell you about everything I've ever studied. And I need one slide on this project and one slide on this project. And then I did this experiment, or then I collected this data. And you just try to like machine gun in all of this different stuff. And as you get more senior, you just realize that that's not feasible, because you'll just collect too much work. But even when you've only got 2 projects or 3 projects in your entire career, you still need that North Star. You're in front of an audience to talk about one idea. And if more than one project can serve that idea, that's great. But if you've got some other project that doesn't relate to the idea, it doesn't need to be in that presentation that day. And that's a bit of a hard lesson. I think all of us who work in research are really passionate about what we do and really care about these projects we've invested, many hundreds or thousands of hours in. But that doesn't mean you need to speak about them every time you're in front of other people. And it's a little counterintuitive, but it really is a big unlock when you can get yourself back to that focus on that main message.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a good segue into one of the other things that you wrote in the book, which was, when reviewers misunderstand you, other readers will too. Take their reaction as an opportunity to refine. And I think that, so many times I see folks who in their writing process or in their presentations, they do it, they get feedback that's not completely positive, and so they react very poorly to that. And I think that this reframing of that is being more growth mindset, right? Like, how does this help me refine and hone in on the thing that I'm actually trying to get across to my audience? I think is really smart advice.
Yeah, great. Yeah, this is one of these experiences that's, I think, pretty close to universal. And I talk a little bit in the book about my first experience as well. I've been through the process many times now, but the very first time I got that big list of feedback back from a journal, it was pretty devastating. Like it's really hard to not take it personally. Again, it was work that I had personally invested in for several years. I had struggled through my first effort at writing an academic paper, very, very hard work, very painful and very slow. And then to just get back pages and pages of comments about all the things that were not sufficiently clearly explained or sufficiently justified or should be cut out was really, really hard. And so I've lived that process. I see it a lot with students, the tendency to be defensive or the tendency to argue. And because you're so invested in what you've put together, completely understandable. I've done exactly that myself. But stepping back now and seeing this many times, I don't know if it's come up yet, but I'm an editor of a journal. So I see this process a lot from the journal side where I'm sending a message to authors. I try to frame the feedback as constructive criticism and opportunity for the author to improve. But I see this defensive reaction over and over. And it's hard because it means that things weren't quite finished when you sent your document out the door to the journal. It's hard because it means there's more work to do before the project is complete. And it can be really fatiguing going through those last steps of a very long process. But on the other hand, it's a great opportunity to fix some things that are going to be challenges for the reader as well. I think it's a funny thing when I'm, getting this feedback and I think, oh gosh, the reviewer just missed this point. Like I made the point in the paper and they just didn't see it and they criticized me, but I clearly talked about it in the paper and it was addressed if only they had read it more closely. But the reviewer is probably going to read that paper at least as closely as any other future reader is going to. And if they miss the point, then you've got a problem, right? You might see the evidence in the paper, but if the reviewer couldn't see it, that's really valuable data. And you've got a chance to address it before all those future readers see your paper. And so if we reframe it to a growth mindset, as you nicely named it, you can say, okay, I've got a chance. I got the cheat sheet. Somebody told me what needs to happen in order for this to be more effective or more persuasive. Let's clean this up before it gets finalized and put into some journal to be, left there for decades to come.
Yeah. Well, and something that I think a lot of professors do or a lot of scholars do whenever they're submitting their work is they typically bifurcate reviewers and the audience as if reviewers are somehow gatekeepers in the way of us getting our work to our audience. But the reviewers, as you just noted, they are a stand-in for the audience. So if your reviewers aren't getting things, if they are not seeing something that you think that you've communicated well, or if they're misreading your work, everyone has an off day. Maybe the reviewer's not great, right? But also it could be just by chance that you did not do a good job communicating in your work, and that you can think about that as, oh, well, if the reviewer didn't see it, my audience won't either. And then that means that my work won't be as effective as it could be, and it won't have the impact that I want it to have because my audience won't understand it. So I really like that reframing of not bifurcating them, but instead thinking of your reviewer as a reflection of the audience that you're trying to get to.
Yeah, this idea, we're particularly with papers, right? They're going to be kind of locked in stone for decades to come once they're finished. And so the more we can get that testing and that feedback before they get totally finalized, the better. And hopefully you've got some colleagues and some friends that'll take a look at your drafts and give you some of that feedback. But your advisor, your reviewers, those are readers too, and they're testers. And so the more reactions you can get from them, the better. And again, they're not infallible. You still have to kind of be thoughtful about judging whether their feedback is aligned with your goals and things like that. But you as the author are not infallible either. And this conversation is such a big part of scholarship of exchanging these ideas back and forth and exchanging these questions back and forth. And it's a real opportunity, even if it's sometimes a pain in the neck to be dealing with those reviews.
Yeah. And I think that one way that you can think about this, and you kind of talk a little bit about this in chapter 5, is that whenever we're approaching the communication of our work to an audience, we can think about it in the same way that we do teaching, right? Whenever we teach a class, we wouldn't say that you're a good teacher if after 16 weeks, all of your students said, I don't understand what went on for the past 16 weeks, right? You can sit there and tell them whatever you want to tell them, but that's not the same thing as teaching. And so I think similarly, how do we sort of engage in our research, both in the writing and the presentation of it as a teaching activity? I think it was a really nice touch. Talk about that a little bit. How have you seen your research influence the way that you teach things?
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. And it's starting out as a professor, it wasn't as apparent to me how our teaching jobs and our research jobs were necessarily synergistic. It was just kind of two different parts of the day. And sometimes you're teaching about topics that you research, but in the end, I think this communication lens really unifies them, that the goal of academic activities broadly is to generate ideas and disseminate those ideas. And the two are quite connected. And presenting at a research conference is in many ways like teaching in a class. You're disseminating ideas. And ultimately, it comes down to the same process. You got to empathize with that audience. What are they looking for out of this engagement? What's going to resonate for them? Are they likely to be skeptical of what you're saying, or are they likely to be receptive and just want to hear details about how to take your ideas into their own work or their own life? and then setting up goals. Like, what are you trying to get out of an academic conference? What are you trying to get out of a quarter long or a semester long class with students? What are you hoping to achieve in terms of that student learning? And then you start figuring out the pieces that you're going to need to reach those goals. And then ultimately getting that feedback through the process is essential. The mechanisms, how these steps play out, are a little different in teaching than in research communication. And teaching, the feedback's going to be kind of a little more in line and while you're teaching the class, whereas in say an academic paper, that feedback might be through the peer review process and things like that. But ultimately, you're wanting to get some information about how things are going, what's working, what's not, and then adjust course to do continually better with these communication tasks. And that teaching really works that way as well. And I think when I've found that when I set aside my own ego and my own personal interests, and I really put the students first of how are they showing up to class, what do they know and what do they not know, what should they know by the end of the class, and how can I best kind of get them to that finish line, that's really enabled a more effective teaching, but also a much more efficient teaching as well. I talk about that a little bit in the book, that not letting the teaching take up your entire life is a big part of life as a professor. And you can really be much more efficient if you can center the students and think about what's the best way to serve learning objectives, rather than thinking about how am I going to cover every idea in this textbook in 10 weeks or 15 weeks, and how am I going to set up this perfect like theatrical performance that's going to like make the students captivated and entertained, and back up and say, well, is captivated and entertained really critical to my learning objectives, or can I come at this from a different approach that might be efficient but even more effective?
Right. Yeah. And I find if you do want a healthy dose of humility, give one of your papers to your students at some point in time and let them read it. I did that this past year, and one of my students was like, this seemed like it was really good, but I didn't understand really anything that you wrote. And I was like, God, well, back to the drawing board then.
Yeah.
Apparently, I didn't do a very good job of communicating what it is that I was trying to accomplish here. So yeah, students have a great way of what they think is a compliment. Oh, you're a professor. You're so smart. Like what you wrote was so smart. I didn't understand any of it. And you're like, oh, well, that actually makes me feel very bad. Oh, so you have this book that you have coming out. Tell us a little bit about that. When's it coming out?
Great.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, great. So the book is called Communication by Design, and the design word there is kind of alluding to this 5-step process we've talked about a little bit today. And the book is coming out on June 3rd, 2026. So just a couple weeks from when we're recording this. The pre-orders are already live on Amazon. And if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to jackwbaker.com/communication. There's a page that's got a link to order the book. There's a free sample chapter you can sign up for if you want to just dig in a little bit more and see what it looks like. There's a bunch of free resources as well, some templates and supporting information just to get a sense of what's going on with the book. It's really a kind of a personal passion for me, and the goal is to just get these ideas out in the world, hopefully unlock some more effectiveness and some more efficiency for students and early career researchers. And so if any of the listeners here are interested in these ideas, I really hope that the book resonates for them and can provide them some more resources to advance their career, build that communication capital.
Yeah. And I know that for a lot of folks, especially with the way higher ed is now, a lot of teachers are very mindful of how much books cost for their students. I think it's really important to note that, Jack, your book it was $9.99 on Kindle, $24.99 in paperback. I can tell you, research methods textbooks are typically those that are the most expensive in any field because they're specialized and they take a lot of work. There's just a lot that goes into those. And so publishing companies usually are pretty bad about jacking up the price on those. So I was really happy to see that this is an affordable text for students, and something that I think that it's not going to be one of those, I read it once for my class and then I never pick it up again. Like, this has information in there that will be helpful for people's careers for years to come. So I think it's a really great book.
Awesome. That's great to hear.
Yeah. And so what's your next project after this then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm currently working on a textbook. So I've written a textbook in my research area, a graduate textbook called Seismic Hazard and Risk Analysis. So I've kind of been through the writing process in that format as well. There's a second edition coming on that.
Congrats.
And then continuing to support my own students through their research journeys. That's such a rewarding part of the job is kind of working with young scholars. And so we'll be continuing to push ahead and hopefully pushing great new ideas out in the world via them as they take off on their own careers.
Well, cool. And for those of you who are listening, I'm sure that Jack would be happy to talk with you all, or maybe do a lecture or a workshop at your place. So he gave gave his website. Jack, one more time, what was the
Yeah, you
website?
bet. jackwbaker.com. That's got my contact information, the links to the LinkedIn and things like that. And yeah, I do some professional education work at professional societies and things on these topics. So happy to
And
hear from interested audience members.
great. And then I'm sure that he'd be a great addition and he can help you all and your grad students figure out how to both create their research and disseminate that in ways that are going to make it effective and make sure that people read it and cite it. So, Jack, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Thanks a lot, Kyle. It was really a pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you all, and we'll see you in next week's episode. Hey, co-authors. What's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.